I never thought I would hear someone screaming into a 911 dispatcher while standing in my own driveway. Especially not after I had just caught her red-handed trying to steal my car keys. But that was the exact moment I realized this situation was about to spiral completely out of control. It all started on what should have been a quiet morning, the kind where nothing out of the ordinary ever happens, until I noticed movement near my vehicle that immediately set off alarms in my head. When I stepped outside, I saw her, the neighborhood HOA Karen, standing far too close to my car with my keys in her hand, acting like she belonged there. For a split second, I honestly thought she had made a mistake. Maybe picked up the wrong set of keys or misunderstood something. But the moment our eyes met, I knew this was no accident. Instead of apologizing or backing away, she doubled down, loudly insisting that she had every right to take them because, according to her, my car was violating HOA rules and needed to be moved immediately. I calmly told her to put the keys down and step away from my vehicle. But she smirked, clearly convinced that intimidation and entitlement would carry her through yet another confrontation. That's when she pulled out her phone, dialed 911, and began telling the dispatcher that she was being threatened by a hostile neighbor who was preventing her from doing her HOA duties. I stood there listening in disbelief as she completely twisted the story, leaving out the small but very important detail that she had been caught stealing my property. What she didn't know, and what made this entire situation even more ironic, was that she had just chosen the absolute worst person in the neighborhood to lie about. I let her finish the call without interrupting, watching her posture shift into one of fake confidence, as if she had already won. She told me, with a smug smile, that I would be arrested the moment the police arrived. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't argue, and I didn't even try to explain myself again. I simply waited, knowing full well that once the truth came out, this situation was going to turn against her faster than she could imagine. As the sound of approaching sirens echoed in the distance, I took a slow breath, because I knew this was just the beginning of a confrontation that would expose exactly how far her sense of entitlement had gone. And she had no idea what kind of authority she had just tried to manipulate. The police arrived faster than Karen expected, and the moment the patrol car pulled up, her entire demeanor shifted into exaggerated victim mode, clutching her phone and dramatically pointing in my direction, as if I were some kind of criminal mastermind. She immediately began explaining how she feared for her safety, claiming I had aggressively confronted her while she was performing HOA duties, carefully avoiding any mention of the fact that she had been holding my car keys moments earlier. The officer listened calmly, nodding as she spoke, while I stood silently to the side, waiting for my turn, because I knew interrupting her performance would only make things messier. When the officer finally asked me what happened, I explained clearly and steadily that I had caught her attempting to take my car keys without permission, that she refused to return them when asked, and that she then called 911 to flip the narrative. I pointed out exactly where she had been standing, showed the officer my vehicle, and calmly stated that the keys were mine and had been removed from my property without consent. Karen immediately jumped in, insisting the HOA had authority over vehicles in the neighborhood and that she was merely enforcing rules. But the officer stopped her mid-sentence and asked a very simple question. Why were the keys not hers? And why was she touching someone else's property? That's when her confidence began to crack. She stumbled over her words, switching explanations, first saying she was moving the car for safety reasons, then claiming it was an emergency, and finally insisting she planned to return the keys later. The officer's expression changed as the inconsistencies piled up, and he asked her directly if she had permission from me to take the keys, to which she could only respond with vague statements about HOA authority. Meanwhile, a small group of neighbors had gathered, quietly watching as the situation unfolded, some clearly uncomfortable, others visibly skeptical of Karen's story. The officer then asked me if I wanted to press the issue further, explaining that taking someone's keys without permission could be considered theft depending on intent. And that's when Karen visibly panicked. She suddenly tried to soften her tone, claiming it was all a misunderstanding and that she had only been trying to help the community. But the damage was already done. The officer informed her that filing a false or misleading 911 report was a serious matter, and that calling emergency services to resolve HOA disputes was not acceptable. As the conversation continued, it became painfully clear that Karen had assumed her usual intimidation tactics would work again. But instead, she was now standing in front of law enforcement with no solid explanation and a growing audience watching her authority crumble in real time. Karen's panic escalated as the officer's attention remained firmly on her inconsistencies, and I could see her usual arrogance melting away with every pointed question. She tried to regain control by speaking louder, attempting to assert that she was within her rights as an HOA member. But each statement contradicted the last, leaving her flustered and hesitant. I calmly explained again that no HOA rule allowed her to take personal property, and that the car keys were mine, emphasizing the fact that I had caught her in the act, which was witnessed by several neighbors. The officer asked Karen repeatedly if she had permission, and each time she hesitated, fumbling for excuses that made no sense, claiming first that she was protecting the neighborhood, then switching to, "I just wanted to move the car," and finally, "I thought it was abandoned," which only made her seem more dishonest. I could see the shift in the officer's demeanor. He now had the full picture, and Karen's attempts to manipulate the situation were failing. The crowd of neighbors grew more attentive, whispering to each other, some recording on their phones, as Karen's composure deteriorated further. The officer then calmly asked me to demonstrate that the keys were indeed mine, and I retrieved them from my pocket, showing that nothing had been tampered with, no damage had been done, and the keys were securely back in my possession. Karen stammered, trying to explain why she thought she could take them. But the logical gaps in her story were glaring. She attempted to appeal to community service and responsibility, but the officer reminded her that personal property rights were paramount and that no one could override them under HOA authority. At this point, it was clear to everyone watching that Karen had underestimated the situation, thinking that intimidation and false claims could work. But she was now completely exposed in front of law enforcement and her neighbors. The officer informed her that filing false reports and taking someone else's property could result in legal consequences, and Karen's face turned red with embarrassment. Her previous confidence entirely gone. I stayed calm and professional throughout, letting the facts speak for themselves, while Karen's narrative continued to unravel with every word she spoke. Finally, the officer wrapped up the conversation, clearly siding with the evidence and my account, warning Karen to refrain from any further unauthorized actions, and she walked away humiliated, muttering excuses while the neighbors watched, many nodding in silent approval at how the situation had been handled. It was a moment of complete exposure for her, showing that no amount of HOA power could substitute for honesty and legality, and that trying to manipulate people in situations would eventually backfire spectacularly. Karen's desperation reached its peak as she realized that not only had she been caught red-handed, but the entire neighborhood was watching, whispering, and recording everything on their phones, making her humiliation absolute and undeniable. She tried one last attempt to manipulate the situation, waving her arms and raising her voice, insisting that I had overreacted and that she was only trying to maintain order. But the officer stayed calm, his eyes fixed on her with a piercing focus that left no room for lies. I stepped forward, recounting the events step by step, making it crystal clear that Karen had no permission, had trespassed, and had attempted to take personal property unlawfully, while neighbors nodded in agreement, confirming every detail I shared. Karen's face flushed red, her voice trembling as she attempted weak excuses, each more implausible than the last, claiming she thought it was community property and was only acting in everyone's best interest. But every word she spoke contradicted her previous statements, and the officer patiently dismantled each one, highlighting the factual inconsistencies with undeniable clarity. The tension in the air was palpable. Karen's body language screamed defeat, her arrogance completely stripped away, and every neighbor present could sense that this was her comeuppance. I calmly reminded her that respect for others' property and the law was non-negotiable, emphasizing that her attempts to intimidate and manipulate would no longer work under scrutiny. The officer then took out a citation pad, documenting the infractions, explaining the potential consequences of unauthorized entry, property interference, and false claims, which left Karen visibly shocked, realizing that her HOA power had limits she had never respected. As the crowd watched in silence, some whispering congratulations, others capturing the moment on video, Karen began to backtrack, mumbling apologies that were hollow and unconvincing, her attempts to regain authority utterly futile. I kept my composure, showing that confidence, professionalism, and adherence to the law always win against arrogance and entitlement. While Karen's increasingly frantic gestures and incoherent explanations only made her downfall more complete. Finally, the officer gave her a firm warning, stating that any further attempts to interfere with my property or spread false claims could result in serious legal action, and Karen had no choice but to leave, walking away humiliated, her head lowered, while the neighbors watched with satisfaction, some nodding in silent agreement, others openly shaking their heads at her audacity. The entire situation had escalated to a climax, where the moral was clear. Entitlement and manipulation cannot overrule facts and law, and trying to bully or coerce someone into compliance will inevitably backfire, especially when the truth is witnessed by multiple people. By the end, Karen's facade was completely shattered. The sheriff had clearly sided with me, and the neighborhood had witnessed a dramatic display of accountability, integrity, and rightful authority prevailing over arrogance and entitlement. As Karen retreated down the street, her face flushed with anger and humiliation, the weight of her actions finally sank in. She had overstepped every boundary, attempted to manipulate the law, and tried to assert authority where she had none. And now everyone around her could see it clearly. The sheriff and I walked back to the property, making sure that everything was secured and that no further interference could occur. Neighbors emerged from their homes, some offering words of support, others sharing the videos they had captured on their phones, which clearly documented Karen's repeated violations, her aggressive behavior, and her complete disregard for property rights. The sheriff took notes on every detail, explaining that Karen's actions could potentially lead to civil penalties or further legal consequences if repeated, and emphasizing the importance of respecting others' property and following proper procedures. I took a moment to address the neighbors, calmly explaining the events, reassuring them that the law was on our side and that entitlement or HOA authority does not permit harassment, theft, or intimidation. Karen, from a distance, tried to shout one last insult, but her voice lacked conviction and the crowd ignored her, their attention fixed on the resolution and the demonstration that standing up for one's rights with composure and facts always prevails. Later, when reviewing the situation with the sheriff, I ensured that every step I had taken was documented, highlighting the importance of evidence, witness statements, and maintaining control of the narrative to prevent false claims or escalation. Karen's eventual retreat marked a turning point, not only for her, but for the entire neighborhood, as residents witnessed firsthand that arrogance, entitlement, and unlawful actions have real consequences. By the end of the day, the property was secure, the community reassured, and Karen's attempts to dominate and intimidate were thoroughly dismantled, leaving her reputation tarnished, while mine and the sheriff's actions were praised for professionalism, fairness, and assertive authority. The lesson was unmistakable. Boldness without respect for the law and others' rights leads to humiliation and accountability. And those who try to manipulate the system must be prepared to face the consequences of their behavior. As the sun set, the neighborhood returned to its normal rhythm. But the story of Karen's failed attempts, the sheriff's fair handling, and the clear triumph of truth, law, and rightful action would be remembered by everyone present, serving as a lasting reminder that integrity and composure are more powerful than entitlement and intimidation, and that standing firm in the face of harassment ensures not only personal victory, but also community respect. Leaving Karen to reflect on the mistakes that had brought her to this moment of public defeat. After Karen's public humiliation and retreat, I realized that the situation was far from over. Her behavior had shown a pattern of entitlement and disregard for the law, and I needed to ensure the neighborhood remained safe and respected. I contacted the HOA and the local law enforcement to officially report the repeated incidents, providing a detailed log of everything that had occurred, including timestamps, witness statements, and video evidence captured by neighbors. The sheriff advised that by documenting every encounter and showing a clear pattern of harassment, I could prevent further escalation and potentially hold Karen accountable legally for trespassing, intimidation, and theft attempts. Over the next few days, I worked closely with the HOA, explaining that their authority ends where property rights and civil laws begin, and that members cannot impose themselves unlawfully on private property. Meanwhile, Karen attempted to spread misinformation on social media, claiming she had been wrongfully targeted. But I had maintained meticulous records, and her claims were quickly debunked, reinforcing my credibility and standing in the community. I also took the time to educate neighbors about the importance of securing personal property, maintaining calm in confrontational situations, and using legal channels rather than reacting impulsively. Karen's attempts to assert control over the neighborhood backfired completely, as her own actions were now documented, analyzed, and criticized publicly, leaving her isolated and discredited. The sheriff emphasized that while confrontation can happen, preparation, documentation, and adherence to the law always shift power to the one acting correctly, not to the one acting aggressively. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had regained a sense of security, and Karen's repeated harassment had only strengthened the community's trust in law enforcement and in each other. It became clear that standing firm, keeping composure, and relying on facts and proper procedures not only protects one's property, but also builds a reputation of integrity and authority that no entitled individual can challenge successfully. Karen was forced to retreat further, realizing that threats, intimidation, and misuse of supposed HOA authority cannot outweigh evidence, law, and truth, leaving the community safe, my property secure, and the lesson of accountability deeply engraved in everyone's minds.